Hello, Canadian Premier League fantasy fans, and even this is just some good news for just Canadian Premier League fans in general. We have, I'd say, a third to a quarter of a schedule that has been released to us. We got week one, the same day the Canadian national team played their game against Aruba, and now we have a full list of 8 games for each team that they're going to have to start off their season in Winnipeg, which was what they're labeling as the Kickoff. I'm here with one of the experts of Canadian soccer, Peter again, and he, just as a reminder, is going to be the manager of a fantasy Canadian Premier League team as well called Forza Forge. So you can follow both of our progress throughout the season. And please take a look at this channel's Instagram and Twitter page. I don't know which corner I'm pointing to, but it's up there. You can see the Instagram icon at CanFPL Forged in Fire, and the Twitter page is at CanFPL Tips Forged in Fire, short form, as well as please subscribe to this channel. It's just one click of a button, and that would really help this little community grow, and hopefully we can get it as big as some people that do this with the actual Premier League. Actually, no, we're the actual Premier League. They're the fake one, okay? But yeah, we're just going to be talking about in this video how the release of the first 8 games is going to impact your starting squad that you're going to be having throughout the first 8 weeks of the fantasy season. Remember, there's going to be transfers all throughout. We don't know if we're going to be given a wild card at any point where we can switch our teams. So who we originally pick has to reflect the schedule ahead, not just the entirety of the season. I do know some people go at fantasy with, these are the best players I can get on my team with the budget I have. Me personally, I try to pick players, not that they're bad players, but I also look at who they're facing and who has either the best chance to score or who has the best chance of getting a clean sheet based on the teams that they're playing. I guess one thing is now all we have based on the current status of all of these teams kind of is how they kind of played last season. Of course, we know that different signings have been made, and we could see like a Halifax that went from one of the worst teams to one of the best within one season. I'm not too educated on necessarily the drastic changes of what's going to happen. A lot of my knowledge is based on last season. I'm going to get, before we get too far into this PowerPoint, I'm going to get Peter to talk to. Do you see any teams that we're going to see a great increase of level from or a decrease coming into the season?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one thing you said right off the top there that is significant is we do only really have last season to go on. Even the first season of the Canadian Premier League, we were one team short to what we had now, and there were so many players at just a different level of the league that don't even kind of speak to the level that we've grown in just 2 years now. Right? There was more. It was more of a experimental kind of thing in the first year. Some really, really good breakthroughs and strides. But I think even just 2 years down the line, we're so far ahead. So with that being said, to your question, I think Forge is as strong as ever. They're going to keep up their level they probably maintained before. We'll talk about them more, but it's interesting to see how they go in a longer season compared to last year. But in terms of a team that's really improved, I'll take this twofold real quick. One, I think the team that's most improved on paper, at least for me, is Valor. When you talk about a team who's improved, Halifax still going to be good. Pacific still going to be good. They're a year older. I think Valor has, through the signings they've made, they have had some significant losses, but they've brought in some signings, which we'll probably talk to at some point a little bit down the line in this video, that make them a very interesting team to watch. And it seems like Rob Gale has really started to put a system on them. You could kind of see it towards the end of the Island games that they were kind of finding their feet, right? So I think he's going to carry that on to the team this year. And just the other note I would have said, again, your question was who's going to be most improved, but one team I think you have to look out for this year who was good last year, even though they might have fell short of expectations, Cavalry. Big signings in Cavalry this year, a much, much improved team. Their question mark's going to be a lot on chemistry. Can they put it all together? But if they can, very, very strong team coming into the season.
All right, so we'll move on. So we are going to dive into each team and their starting schedule. There's just a couple things that we wanted to touch on first. And there could be, some other analysts have talked about it too, some implications based on the late start of training, especially in our Ontario teams. Ottawa was able to get out based on their affiliation with Atletico Madrid and able to get training a little earlier, but Forge and York United now, not York 9, they've been stuck and have been training, I guess, individually and not able to use their facilities for quite a while now. So basically they're just going to have, I think they've been training the last week, but then we're only 2 weeks away. So we're going to have about 3 weeks of training as a team before we kick off the season. And so I guess my question would be, do we think that this is going to be very impactful on the start of the season, or do you think this will be something that they can get over pretty easily and seamlessly?
I think it has to be an impact, right? Forge especially, they've played a lot of games, so I think they could be less affected as, say, maybe a York, because they did have that long CONCACAF League run, and they are seemingly so far bringing in some decent quality signings. Speaking of, Bobby did give us a quote this week saying that there's more to come in training, so we're going to keep an eye out for that. But I think Forge will be better equipped to handle it. York, it's going to be tough for them. They do have a lot of players who've been on loan, Dominic Sator being a big one. Julian Albright was in Germany for a while. But they also have a big turnover of guys. So to come into a new league where you haven't been training, haven't had the chance to really put your team together, and ask them to just go into competition against teams who've been training the whole time, I think that could be a big ask for them. We'll talk about Ottawa once we get to their schedule a little bit more.
Yeah, I also kind of agree with Forge. Like, they did play some games later than all the other teams, as well as they're a team that, as the last season, they're all coming together again. Most of it's the same. So hopefully they don't need as much time to build the team chemistry like someone like York 9 would.
Yep.
All right, another thing to touch on is frequency of games. And if you played the Island Games Fantasy Canadian Premier League, you would have already dealt with some of these complications, because it was a very quick turnover schedule for the entirety of that season. We might not have to have that throughout this entire season, but definitely the first 8 games while we're in the kickoff, as we're branding it. And so the way that this is set up is there's going to be 2 games a week for each team for a month. And it's kind of interesting. I didn't know that this was going to happen right from the start, but it's come out that each team is only going to be facing 4 opponents twice. Mm-hmm. So 3 of the teams they won't see until they go back to home markets, which is the goal of this. You're going to see lots of rotation within the squads. And so part of the tactics in your fantasy team is finding players that are very nailed on, meaning that they almost play every game regardless of the amount. So I know last week we touched on, when we were just speaking explicitly about Forge, it was the center backs, and then we also said Kyle Becker plays every game. So it's those kind of players, except now we need to look at them within all of the teams, not just Forge. And we will have videos about that later on. And being able to predict the starting 11, and this isn't saying the best players for each team that makes the best team. No, you need to go in and think, this player played this week, so will they play the next week? Or this player didn't play last week, they could feature in this week. So it's not necessarily picking the best 11 for that team, but picking who is going to play based on who played the previous week. So you got to follow those rotation patterns. Do you agree that there's going to be a lot of rotation coming along, or do you think some teams will try to stick out these 8 games and keep a consistent team throughout?
I think if you have to go based on what history tells us, which is all we have really, I think you have to go based on the certain manager styles, right? I'm looking at, for example, the 2 finalists from last year. Bobby, he didn't show it as much in the CONCACAF League, as we mentioned last video, but he's always traditionally been a coach who likes to switch things up game to game. And this seems like the schedule that perfectly suits that style for him. So I could see Forge being very rotational outside of the certain guys you mentioned, like Becker. But I look on the flip side to the other finalist, Halifax. If I recall from their Island Games run, Stephen Hart just went with the same lineup pretty much for most of the games. He had his core group. He did make a few substitutions game to game, but there were certain guys there that Rampersad, Sissoko, Garcia, you could count on them in almost every game, especially the ones that mattered. So I think that as we move forward, it's going to be big to pick up on the tendencies of the managers as much as it is to look for potential injuries or other factors that might contribute to squad rotation.
Yeah, I guess we can count that last group stage match against Pacific as a bit of an outlier because they had already made it through. So that's a good point there. All right, so now we're going to break down each team. I do have a little breakdown of how they did in the island games as a refresher. The team icons are the order in which they play each team. I didn't put the date down. Each one plays about every 3 or 4 games, or 3 or 4 days, give or take, for the whole entirety of the 8 games, and you can check that schedule. So looking at Forge first, obviously we know that they're the winner of the Canadian Premier League and the Island Games last season with 6 wins, 4 draws, and only 1 loss, scoring the most goals over the course of the Island Games. Keep in mind that they also played the most games as well as Halifax, so they did have more time to accumulate those goals than teams that would have got knocked out earlier in the Island Games, so the bottom 4 teams there. But going with everything and culminating everything here, and they let in 10 goals. Why is this important? We need to know which teams are going to be scoring, which teams are attacking, and which teams are more defensive. Okay, and as we see, Forge has the same rotation over the 8 games. We get Valor, Edmonton, Pacific Cavalry, and we go through that again. So stereotypically from last year, this is a pretty good first 2 fixtures, followed by 2 more difficult ones. And now, as Peter was talking to, Valor does seem, he does see the potential of them growing as a team. Let's not forget that they're also going to be the home team, and that might be a challenging game coming up against a home team, and while you also have only been training for 3 weeks. So that could be a bit of a game that when you put the 2 logos together lined up might not be as clear-cut as it might seem. And let's not forget, you also have, if it's any consistent with last year, which I think they'll keep it pretty consistent, you have 3 transfers per week. Maybe they'll change that up a bit, but I'm going based on last year's rules. And what that means is if you like those first 2 fixtures, but you don't like the next 2, you will have that opportunity to transfer players out and get in different players that might have better fixtures for that after those first 2 games. But we always know Forge are likely going to be a favorite, if not a 50-50% chance to win each game. So you do have a pretty good chance of returns. Do you like the schedule for Forge? Do you agree that those 2 first games are a chance to really accumulate some points, or do you see this being more of a struggle as they have 2 teams that are in the group stage from last year as well as an up-and-coming Valor team?
Definitely. So I think in this schedule, the way it's set up, where you play the same 4 teams twice, I think level of competition is going to be huge here, especially from the fantasy angle, because if you look at this schedule, now, obviously, for me personally, I think Valor has improved. That first game, if Forge doesn't come out ready to play, Valor could catch them off. But let's go based on last year's results, just for the sake of statistics. You're looking at this, the first 2 matches are easy, the next 2 matches are hard, back to 2 matches that are easier, back to 2 more difficult matches. If Bobby's going into this, planning his lineup, he's going to know, all right, these first 2 games, those 2 games when you get to play Valor and Edmonton, those 2 sets, I have to go out and get full points. He's going to probably play his strongest lineup. Not that he won't play his strongest lineup for Cavalry and Pacific, but if it's a condensed schedule, you know, guys are laboring, maybe you play more of a defensive lineup, right? You get guys out there who can just kind of run against the opposition and not try to go for it, put them on the front foot. Maybe you rest the Borges or you bring him on as a sub in one of those games. You know what I mean? So I think level of competition is going to be huge. It'll be interesting to see how Valor does against Forge in these games. But I think it's going to very much be 2 game sets that he takes in. I want to make one interesting note here that the last, so you don't have the dates down, but the last game Forge has in this set against Cavalry is the 22nd of July. Next week on April 16th, we find out Forge's CONCACAF League first round matchup. That's a 2-leg tie. The first match Forge has to play for CONCACAF League, which could be against Marathon again, which I don't want to go there, is August 3rd. So that's roughly just over a week after that last Cavalry game. Does Bobby look at that game? If Forge has accumulated enough points through all those other games, does he go into that game and think, you know what, maybe it's a good game to rest a few guys. We have CONCACAF League. We want to do well in that tournament. Maybe we take that one off, because obviously the CPL season doesn't end at the end of this. This is just the kickoff. We're moving back. So if Forge looks at that Cavalry game and says, you know what, it's too close to CONCACAF League, we have injuries, we're going to take some guys off. From a fantasy perspective, I would note that game, because you might get some guys rested that game you weren't expecting.
That's a good point. Yep. And obviously, myself and Peter haven't hid the fact that we're Forge fans. We don't just talk them up because they are a team. I think a lot of people, especially with 2 titles from now, would agree that they're a team to try to accumulate at least some players from eventually. But as far as fantasy videos come, I do try to take an open mind to all teams and not put one in front of the other. But yep. I know last video we had an exclusive Forge FC one, and this we're starting out with them being a big favorite. So I hope if you're a fan of another team, you still enjoy the content here, and we'll try not to accumulate any bias towards anything. Yep. All right, next, and I've listed these teams just in order that they came in the Island games in case you're seeing a theme. But we're looking at Halifax next. Last year, we saw them play, we saw them always compete in every game. They had a pretty balanced record with 4 wins, 4 draws, and 3 losses. They scored 15 goals and allowed 16 goals. So again, in 2 of those goals coming in that extra game, they played above everyone else. So they did have more time to score and to get scored on. So that's why we see a bit of a higher goals against total, but they were very much known for their very strong defense. Why is that goals against total so big? Well, I think they let in 5 goals against Pacific when they completely put in a B squad to rest players for the final. And Pacific took advantage of that and buried them in goals. So if you take out that outlier, you're looking at only 11 goals against. I'd say they have a really balanced schedule. They face the same 4 teams Forge does, but you're looking at a difficult game, an easier game, a difficult game, an easier game. And they don't have a perfect rotation there. But I think that you can rely on a certain amount of clean sheets as you go along, as well as if you look at the end of those 8 games, depending on what schedule comes out when we hopefully return to home markets, this could be a really good game to take a team to focus on looking out of the kickoff. Because if they face either one of these teams again, or you get an Athletico Ottawa in your next game or something like that, you're looking at a really good run of fixtures to possibly bank on some points from either players like Akeem Garcia and Morelli, or even a keeper like Oxner picking up a bunch of clean sheets in a row. And so do you see Halifax still being a big powerhouse this year, trying to make another run for a title, or are they going to falter back to that first season form again?
I think this is the big question. We only have 2 seasons to see. I will say one thing that's going for them is consistency. Okay, from last year, 2 big losses that I can see off the roster. Okay, well, 3, but I think they'll find a way to replace from within. So the one that they lost was Kristovic Ensa. He's gone to York. They've replaced him with Maury Donor from York, which is a basic one-for-one swap. Are they an equal player? Time's going to tell. The other one they lost, which I think they have upgraded on because he didn't play very well in the Island games, to be honest. Louis Ballon-Goyette, serviceable player, didn't play very much. They replaced him with Jeremy Gagnon-Laparé. Comes from USL, used to play for Montreal and MLS. Very serviceable player. He should slot right into that midfield. So they've lost apologies. They lost Sissoko. That was another big loss that I mentioned, the 3rd one. Okay. So they've lost Sissoko to USL. So they have pretty much a consistent lineup. They've replaced the important guys they've lost with players. Can they come in and be consistent, and can they do it over a long period of time? I'm looking at that schedule. If they can steal a couple points off Cavalry, Pacific, and put those run of form together, then yeah, I think they could be a team that you could bank on to generate some consistency and go pretty far. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. And yeah, we never know what's going to happen with some of these transfers, so we'll see how they balance each other out. Okay, looking at Cavalry. So they had a very good Island games up until the group stage. They look strong again, just like they did the first year, with 5 wins, a draw, 4 losses, and 14 goals for and 11 against. And they have both Island Games finalists making up half of their first 8 games. They have Halifax and Forge, each that they'll be playing twice, as well as a York United side, which was expected to do really well in the Island Games and didn't, but now they have another year under their belt. They do have a lot of overall rotation, just transfers in and out. So we'll see if they're going to fall back into the start that they had in the Island Games, or if they're going to come together and mesh well. They do only have a couple weeks to train beforehand. But let's not forget, Cavalry finished the fall season, or the spring season and the fall season last year, top of the table, which a lot of people feel that they got snubbed just by losing a 2-leg tie to Forge. They also came first in the first round of the Island Games, but 4 teams go through and only 2 come out of that, and Cavalry didn't live up to expectations during the group stage as well. So over the course of a longer table season, Cavalry, that seems to be where Cavalry thrives, not necessarily in a competition with a small amount of games, but with a larger amount of games. So I can see Cavalry being a strong team overall, but as far as this first run of fixtures go, I don't think they can be relied on for any of these, maybe the 2 against Athletico Ottawa, but I think Cavalry was one of the teams that Ottawa got one of their 2 wins against last year. So I do think that this is a tough start to the season for them, but obviously what's going to follow a bunch of games against hard teams will eventually probably be a bunch of games against easier teams. So as Peter talked about, this is a good team that sounds like it's going to get better, and they just have a hard start to the season, but if they can grind some wins out against some of these bigger teams, I think that'll kickstart them to even do better throughout the mid-season. What is it about Cavalry that you think has even taken them to another level coming into this next season?
Plain and simply, well, your point about Cavalry and longer drawn seasons doing well, I think that's huge. Tommy Wilden is built for a more traditional league table than I think a playoff kind of format. But just quickly, I know we don't want to get into all the signings today, but just with this team specifically, the players they've lost were big players for them over the last 2 years, okay? Mavilla, Northover, Zator, Wielden, Bruno Zebi, Boscovich, Jordan Brown, Marcus Haber, Jared Cordova. A lot of big players for them. But they, in my opinion, have gone and replaced them with like even better players in many, many aspects. Tyson Farago from Valor is their new backup to Carducci. Very serviceable. Karifa Yao from Montreal, Klump, Field, D. Chiara, Richard Luca, David Norman Jr. from the Canadian Olympic team, Ahinga Salamani, underrated player. He'll be a fantasy one to watch. Novak from Forge, Joe Mason, who everyone's talked about from MK Dons, straight from League One. And the asterisks on this team, are they going to get Pebble back, who's with Getafe right now? He's technically still a Cavalry player. I think he's on loan. So if they get him back after a year in Spain, suddenly you look at this team and you think, wow, that is a team like Forge with a lot of guys who are maybe perceived as higher than CPL level right now. So like you said, I think it's going to be about, can they overcome these stronger teams in a short span at the beginning? And like I said earlier, can they really put the chemistry together to make them this team that on paper looks phenomenal? So we're going to see.
Yeah, I was looking in Canadian Premier League Fantasy pointed out Oliver Platt put out the roster so far for every single team. And I saw they have added a lot to their attacking depth, and especially in a time where you're going to have a lot of rotation. They got a lot of options where you're going to rotate. Like we even saw in Forge, Novak was one that was normally a sub for us, or he started about half the games. And if they have him to fill in that same role, and we saw how dangerous Novak was for us, so I'm sure he'll be the same for them. All right, moving on to Pacific, our last group stage entrant from last year, which finished with 4 wins, 2 draws, and 4 losses, 16 goals for. Again, remember 5 of them are against a B team from Halifax, and 13 goals against. They have the same difficult set of teams that Cavalry has. So again, just keep that in mind. But they have so much attacking talent. And again, I guess now seeing the transfers and hearing it again from Peter, Cavalry does have that too. But it's still maybe worth to have that Bustos player in your team, or that Blasco. Campbell didn't really live up to expectations last year, but he had a good first season. So can you go back to him? So do you think that they're going to have that strong attacking presence again? Or do you think, again, hold off until maybe the next set of fixtures is explained?
So if I'm being honest, this is my dark horse team for this whole year. I think Pacific has done exactly what everyone said from day one in the CPL when they built this team. They said this is a team 2-3 years down the line is going to be mature into greatness, and that's what they have. This team's just gotten another year older from being very young. I really, really like Pamadou Ka, his mentality, his tactics, his overall presence. It's really boosted the team in the league. So in terms of their changes, all they lost, Marcel Dion retired. He's a big presence, but was he as influential on the field anymore? Not too sure. And they lost both Verhovens, who they replaced with Aparicio in the middle, who's an upgrade, in my opinion, over Noah Verhoeven. And Ollie Bassett's a former North Ireland Youth International. He'll play left back. So it really seems that this team is the same all-star caliber team with some big players like Bustos, Blasco from last year. Campbell finds his form. I think this is a team you have to watch to go on a deep run this year. And I think they're going to mature into that team that we all knew they could be one day.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, those players, Aparicio from when they played on York 9, now York United, he scored so many points for me coming from there. And now he's playing with even more attacking talent than he had before. And of course, you have those all-time like CPL threats that stand out like Bustos and them. So I think it's still worth taking a look at their strikers at least. Okay, moving on to York United. That's a nice new crest they have and new branding that they went through. The only team to do that so far. They had an underwhelming Island Games. I predicted them to finish second in the original stage, and they finished, I think it's fifth. Yeah. So they finished with 2 wins, 4 draws, 1 loss, 8 goals for, and 7 goals against. And this is the only team, though, that was able to beat Forge during the entire Island Games. And they have the same set of fixtures as Forge does. So a lot of teams have the same groupings of teams. It's almost like they made a bubble within a bubble in a way, sort of. And so they start out with 2 harder fixtures. But again, after those 2, you can start transferring in these York United players. And that's maybe when it's time to capitalize them right before that Edmonton game and as they face Valor. And then you can maybe hold on to them going into after the 8 games as well. So that's why I have there to transfer in some York players for game week 2. I guess I have a little typo there in the thing, but it was supposed to say game week 2 as they go and face Edmonton or Valor. I know we kind of touched on them a bit. They brought in a lot of attacking power last year, and now it's changing again a bit. Do you see like the losses of Wright and Telfer being a big loss for them, or do you think they brought in the right pieces quickly?
I think, first of all, it's the opposite of Forge, right? So instead of 2 easier to 2 harder games, we're going 2 harder to 2 easier. So keep that in mind as you're planning your squads. Yeah, I think they've replaced pretty well based on paper. There's some guys they brought in, Hamilton, who's playing in the Scottish second tier from Jamaican International, Julian Albright, the German, Zator can get forward, Ensa can get forward, Tariq Mohammed's on loan from the Irish top flight, former TFC2 and FC Edmonton player. There's some other guys, Jordan Wilson, Noah Verhoeven, like we just mentioned. They've added a lot. It looks good. Can they put it together? And can they come back from this lack of training? That's going to be their biggest question.
Yeah, this could be like a good time where you start off with the Forge players and then you can shift to the York 9 players after those 2 games. So I could see transfers being made like Crutzen to Zator or something like that, where you're having those similar players except going back to those favorable fixtures. Okay, going on to the home teams. This is the only team that has home side advantage, Valor FC. They, I think, they played better than they did during the first season for sure, but they still aren't at that top caliber level yet. They have the hard run of fixtures, especially the first 2. They played both Island Games finalists right away. So another team probably to stay away from right at the very start. But over game weeks 3 to 7, if York United doesn't live up to expectations and they do have that good, I know not backing for necessarily a crowd, but that home feeling to have their supporters close by, they have an opportunity to pick up clean sheets, there'll be 2 games against Athletico Ottawa in there. We'll see how York United performs again. Those late start implications could affect both York and Forge. So there are some opportunities for clean sheets there. I don't think they've changed the transfer too much up top. I think there's 1 or 2 or something. Maybe it's mostly in the midfield that they've got new ones, but I could see them being defensively strong. Do you see that trend continuing, or do you think maybe there's even good attacking options?
Yeah. So again, this team is very interesting. In the back, on paper, you could argue that they have one of the best backlines in the league. You could argue because they have a Panamanian international who wasn't here last year, Soto. You mix him with Andrew Jean-Baptiste. You have Brett Levi, who's sometimes a left back, sometimes a left mid. They made arguably the signing of the summer just last week. That Brazilian Serie A straight from player, Gallardo. He is a right back, sometimes center defensive mid, but apparently he's more of a wing back. He might be the CPL player with the biggest pedigree. Like we have to see what he brings to the field. But in terms of their attacking options, 2 guys. One, I think Kevin Alleman, coming from FC Edmonton. He is actually a very, very talented player. For those who don't know, he's played in the Costa Rican top flight. He's played in the lower leagues in Spain. He will be out to prove something, and I think he can do well in Robert Gale's system. And up front, there's a young player they signed from NCAA, William Akio. He actually just made his first full international cap with the South Sudan national team in Africa. He is a very intriguing prospect. He scored a lot in NCAA, and to see a guy like that come to the CPL this young, this early, is interesting. So we'll see what he can do. He might be the X factor. He might be one of those bargain buys in terms of fantasy. You might want to get on those in the weeks they play Ottawa and York.
Yeah, and we'll touch more on player prices and specifics in a future video. Okay, we have 2 more, and they're probably 2 that we won't pick at too much just because it is unlikely that people will find them as hot commodities. But Athletico Ottawa, it was their first season last year, and even though they only got 2 wins and 2 draws, I still think they exceeded people's expectations. A lot of people just had them pegged dead last right from the start, and they did get those 2 wins, 2 draws, as well as the 3 losses. They scored 7 goals and had 12 against. And so they might have the best opening fixture of the season. I believe this is the first game of the kickoff, and it's against Edmonton, as we saw last year. I don't know if they're going to get any better. And so that might be a team to start having players that, even if they are weaker, have strikers like Telfer at a new location. He might be a good pick to start off with, or Shaw if he's still got the starting position. But it's just hard to trust them. There's a lot of turnover in the team, and I don't know if during another bubble is the best chance to take a fly on them. And they do have harder fixtures after that. But they're a team also that doesn't have an exact rotation. They will have Cavalry a little earlier than you'd expect them to have them again, and they might have an easier ending to this first 8 games, so maybe get them towards the end. Do you see them being significantly better and starting to be a contender, or do you see them falling kind of where they were before?
I will say, I think last year towards the end of the Island Games, they did make some great strides. But if we're being honest, Athletico Ottawa and another team who may come up in the near future in this presentation are going to be towards the bottom of the league. The other teams have just grown so much. They've built cultures. They've built their squads over years. This team's really just getting started. They haven't even ever played a home game yet. We kind of forget that. So I think they did really well towards the end to kind of develop some camaraderie. They got a win, which was great. But, losing Ben Fisk, losing Javier Acuna, that's a huge loss who they thought they could have for at least a couple of years. They've done well to replace a few guys. Ryan Telfer, Brian Wright, former MLS player, he's pretty good. But at the end of the day, I think that if they can just go into some games and keep them close, maybe they're good in terms of fantasy value for one of those guys like Telfer. If he can be like their focal point, maybe you can trust him to bag you some goals. But otherwise, I don't see much coming from them.
Yeah, and when you face some challenging teams in there as well, that's not really looking like I'm gonna be taking maybe one Athletico Ottawa player at most. Shout out to Ben Fisk for winning the Canadian Premier League Fantasy last year as well. He was following Instagram. I don't think he is anymore, but we'll see what happens later on if he gets back into it.
And speaking of Ben, we don't know where he is right now. We don't know what team he's going to be on. Potentially one of the Forge signings. We'll have to see.
All right, and the last team to get to is FC Edmonton. I'm not going to spend much time here because they showed us basically anything, or they didn't really show us anything last season. 0 wins, 1 draw, and 6 big losses. They only scored 5 goals. Basically, all of those goals, I know there was someone else, but basically all 5 coming from Ngaro. I did have him on my team a little bit, and he did actually do not too bad. But again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to trust any of them when you have especially Forge and Halifax making up 4 of their first 7 games. And yeah, I might wait to actually see them play before I trust any of them. I'd like to see improvement before taking them into my team. Just touch on it quickly if you want. Do you see them climbing the table at all this year, or kind of staying where they are?
It's tough. I think, if York can't really put it together, if Athletico Ottawa comes up flat like we think, maybe they're competing with those teams. But realistically, just in terms of players to see that, Shamit Shom, one of probably the biggest CPL signings. He's going to be good. But on a team like Edmonton, is he fantasy value? Probably not. They brought in Porter from York 9, Fraser Aird. They just signed a center back from USL who looks okay, Gorski. They still have some guys, Sagai, and Ungaro had a really, really good loan spell in Denmark. So they have some potential for some standouts, but I think it's going to be more of hit and miss. I will say the one X factor they have, they signed a Peruvian player last year who couldn't come to the island games, but he's in the country now apparently, Raul Tito. He's up front. He could be a guy who could help spark them. I don't know if he links well with Ungaro. Maybe he's someone you take for fantasy value for some goals, but otherwise I don't see much coming from them this year, unfortunately, for the Eddies fans.
Yeah, so again, when we're talking fantasy, you want to try to use as little money you can at the back to get those premium strikers. And while it could be good to have a budget striker up front, normally you try to play 3 strikers at the top and you want those to be premium options, so not somewhere where I personally like to take a flyer from. But if your budget requires it, like there are some big defenders that could be listed as defenders this upcoming year, and that could get you some points. So maybe you do need some budget players up top, and that could be an option for you. But like I said, this is a team, I know they face Athletico Ottawa first, and that could be seen as an easier match. But I think I'm going to need these FC Edmonton players to show me and prove to me that they're a team worth picking players from. So to summarize the whole rundown, sorry if the chat heads are blocking the screen a bit. But it kind of seems obvious and just a cliche of just the CPL in general to say probably 2 teams you want to look at most are Forge and Cavalry, and teams that you probably want to avoid are Valor and Edmonton. This is based off of the starting fixtures as well. But those are teams that have the caliber that have proven that, yes, we're going to score goals, and yes, we're going to pick up wins and keep clean sheets occasionally as well. Whereas the other 2 kind of have more to prove, and you're going to obviously sprinkle players in, probably going to have some Pacific attackers or Halifax defense as well, trying to pick and choose based on the fixtures, what games can I get clean sheets in. And you don't want to have to like just use a player one game and get them out. You want to be able to look at the fixtures and pick players that I can use for 3-4 weeks in a row and feel confident with it, so I can focus on other parts of my team to go transfer players in and out of. But I think most people kind of agree, try to build your team mostly with Forge and Cavalry to start, so maybe picking 3 from each of those teams and then sprinkling in the others. Whereas I'm probably not going to have any Valor or Edmonton players in my starting lineup. Maybe one Valor, I know they played strong defense last year, and as the home team, that might be what draws me to pick 1 or 2 players from them. But other than that, I'm sticking towards the big 2 rivalry there, and as well as some options from other teams. Okay, so that is, oh, that's okay. I was going to say there is the last slide there. I'll just pull it right back up for a sec.
As you're pulling that up, I'll come in just quickly. I wanted to add, as we were making this video, some breaking CPL news that's pretty intriguing, especially for us on the analyst side of things. Christian Jack, KJ, famous Canadian footy expert who's been around for a long time. He's just been named the VP of Media and Content for the entire CPL. Really enjoyed his takes lately on One Soccer. I think he's definitely going to be someone that will bring a lot of valuable insights to the CPL specifically. How does that translate to us? If you're able to follow him, we will definitely be following him. What he says, his articles, his opinions on players could help contribute to what we determine, what Daniel determines are good fantasy value picks. So congrats, KJ. Hopefully one day we'll get him on the show and talk some fantasy footy.
Oh, we might be a bit away from that, but there is a picture of the schedule if you want to take a look at that. Please, once again, follow the social media pages and subscribe to this. You could be one of the first subscribers if we do ever get big. So that'll be something that you can put to your name as well, starting to support the growth of the channel. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks again, Peter, for joining me in this and putting in your 2 cents or maybe 3 cents. It's pretty good advice there. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care.
Awesome.